comes from the German, which is heroisch, which means strong or heroic. So that's how the name came about. It was marketed as a non-addictive morphine substitute and a cough suppressant because at the time morphine was being abused quite a bit. We didn't have the legislation that we have now, so a lot of drugs were out there. I mean, Coca-Cola had cocaine in it, things like that. Well, this was going to be a cure for morphine addiction, and soon it had one of the highest rates of dependency among users. So in 1914, the U.S. basically banned heroin and a lot of other drugs. In 1924, manufacturing was banned. So it is a Schedule I, if you know your drug schedules. It's a Schedule I drug, which means there's no medicinal use for it, can't be prescribed, and there's no acceptable safety on it. Now, that's not the same with all illicit drugs, actually. Cocaine is used in the hospital. As a pharmacy tech before med school, I used to issue cocaine. It's a great vasoconstrictor and stops bleeding if you have an ear, nose, and throat surgeon operating in the sinuses or something like that. Heroin has no such use in the United States. In England, it's a little different. In the UK, you can actually prescribe heroin. And it's actually called diamorphine or diamorph. It's used for treatment of severe pain, and it's also available to treat opioid addiction, believe it or not, in some European countries. In the United States, we have other drugs for that. We have methadone, we have buprenorphine. Those are used for treating opioid addiction, not heroin. Obviously, we're usually treating the heroin addiction with those. So in its purest form, it's usually a white powder, but it comes in lots of different flavors. In Colorado and west of the Mississippi, we tend to see black tar heroin. Actually, that's a little bit fortuitous for us because it's hard to mix fentanyl and other drugs with black tar heroin, which is one of the reasons why, despite my toxicology searches for the last 5 years, looking for both the presence of heroin and fentanyl, I don't see a lot of combinations, and I know that's not the experience for many of you. If you're in the East Coast, where they often see white, powdery heroin, it's easy to mix other drugs in with those, and you're seeing a combination fentanyl, heroin being distributed. We don't get that in Colorado, and a lot of the states west of the Mississippi don't have that experience. Some of the names for heroin: H, big H, smack, junk, skag, and then just describe it by color, or even the fact that black heroin is a tarry substance, so they call it tar. A little chemistry for you. Basically, heroin comes from these countries around the world. Afghanistan was the primary producer. The war there in the 2000s kind of stymied that a little bit. Mexico produces most of the heroin in the United States, and then it makes it across the borders. We still get opium from the poppies in Afghanistan, but most of the production of heroin is done in Mexico. I mentioned the chemistry, but we'll get to that in a second. So Mexican cartels produce the black tar heroin, as I mentioned, and that's what we're seeing in this part of the country. It's easier to make. Synthesis is rather straightforward, and it yields a higher percentage of when you take morphine, making it into heroin. On the way there, you end up producing some 6-monoacetylmorphine, which many of you will recognize, and we'll talk about that chemistry in a little bit. That is also a very potent narcotic, and is a transient metabolite that you see in the body. So opium to basically brick morphine, and then production. So the opium gum is changed into, or at least concentrated into, a brick of morphine, and then the chemical attack is done on the morphine itself to add those two acetyl groups, and voila, you get heroin. Now, many people think that codeine, erroneously think that codeine it comes out of this process. It actually doesn't. Codeine is there with the morphine from the opium plant. So it's along for the ride. So when you're testing for somebody that you think is a heroin overdose, you almost always see codeine. That codeine is not a byproduct of metabolism or anything like that. It was there in the heroin that was being used, and it came along for the ride. And it's usually there in small concentrations. So even if you don't have, and we'll talk about 6-monoacetylmorphine in a second, even if you don't have that to hang your hat on, if you have a high morphine blood concentration and a low codeine blood concentration, they were probably using heroin. So the refining process, again, heat, some other chemicals, add those two acetyl groups, and you make heroin. Now we'll get to your biochemistry class here a little bit. Essentially, heroin is diacetylmorphine. So you have morphine, you add an acetyl group, that gives you monoacetylmorphine. You add another acetyl group, you have diacetylmorphine. The body reverses that process, but the body can't drive the process forward. So you can't get too much morphine in your system and start making monoacetylmorphine out of it in the body. You can't get too much monoacetylmorphine and drive the equation to diacetylmorphine and actually make endogenous heroin. It doesn't work that way. It goes only one direction. So you have diacetylmorphine in your system, heroin, quickly breaks down to monoacetylmorphine, and that actually doesn't last very long either. We almost never see diacetylmorphine on toxicology. So when you're testing for heroin, you're not testing for the presence of diacetylmorphine or heroin. You're testing for morphine, and you're hoping to capture a little bit of that fleeting monoacetylmorphine that's going to get metabolized very quickly down to morphine. And that's really what you're looking for on toxicology. How does the heroin get into the United States? Well, luggage, transport trucks going across the border, mules, body packers. I'm going to show you an interesting case involving that here in a second. Could look like this. There's the product, kind of a tan color to this one. A little bit more of a tarry substance there. How do people administer it? Any way they can creatively do it, right? Most people think of injection. That's not the only way, though. People put it in the rectum, put it in their vagina, smoke heroin, using a hookah, snorting it, and, any which way people can get it into their system. If you're an addict, you will get creative. This is sort of the standard paraphernalia you'll see at the scene, often a spoon that's has evidence that heat has been applied to it. Cotton sometimes is used to kind of keep the particulate matter out of the syringe. The addict is usually not worried about that particulate matter getting into their bloodstream. What they're really worried about is the needle gets blocked from it. So you got to make sure you get the liquid into the syringe, right? Again, various ways of using it. So I mentioned that heroin becomes monoacetylmorphine very quickly, and then just morphine. And this is just in a matter of hours. So what we want to catch is that monoacetylmorphine. Now, it doesn't tend to break down after death, so you're good to go there. If you don't do the autopsy till the next day or 2 days later, that'll probably be okay. But the problem is, while the addict is using, any sort of delay between the time of injection and the time of death, that heroin has certainly gone to monoacetylmorphine, and then the monoacetylmorphine may go away. How do we increase our yield on toxicology? Try some alternate fluids. Vitreous fluid will often yield monoacetylmorphine when blood does not. Urine. In fact, the only time I actually add urine to my tox is when I think that heroin's been used. For the most part, I want blood toxicology. Urine tox doesn't really tell me much. But with the laboratory I use, if I think heroin's been used, I add urine on there. And that's only to cast my net a little wider, see if I can get that monoacetylmorphine. Levels have very little relationship to death. And anybody who has done an autopsy, interpreted an autopsy, read an autopsy report on a heroin death knows that. Because how do we know that? Well, I'm in court asked all the time about the toxicology on somebody who has 10 gunshot wounds in them. Like, oh, wait a minute. they were using heroin or cocaine. Aren't those high levels, doctor? Well, yeah, they are, and it doesn't matter. You can die of a heroin overdose with very low levels, and you could die of your gunshot wound with very high levels. And the same is true for cocaine, for methamphetamine, and some of the other stimulants. But somebody may survive several hours, and then the breathing center decides to give out. They may even survive long enough to get hospitalized and then die of complications of their respiratory arrest, which is the mechanism for an opioid overdose. So, how does heroin work in the body? Well, heroin, as it breaks down into the other metabolites, binds to opioid receptors in the brain, causes that euphoria, causes all kinds of different things, but it also causes respiratory depression, and that's basically how they die. At autopsy, what do we see? Often cerebral edema, swelling of the brain. That's the brain's reaction to any time it's deprived of oxygen. Pulmonary edema is kind of the characteristic finding. Heavy lungs, foam in the trachea, foam in the bronchi, urinary retention, which makes it nice because I want that urine to send out for 6-monoacetylmorphine testing. Often you'll see other things at autopsy like track marks. Finding injection sites is nice. It's not always easy. As the addict goes on in their career, they get more and more creative, and sometimes they're well hidden or just not that obvious. Cirrhosis is caused by hepatitis that they get from injecting drugs into their system and sharing needles. And then they get chronic lung diseases because they don't get all that particulate matter out of the liquid, and some of it gets into the bloodstream and causes problems with heart valves and with the lungs. So heroin causes death by itself, but in concert with other drugs like fentanyl. Some of the classic presentations that we see are people who have just gotten out of rehab or just gotten out of prison, right? Because they go back to what they were using, and their tolerance is way down. I can't tell you how many cases I've had in Denver in my 5 years there where the story goes, just got out of prison and probably didn't even go anywhere else before they, scored a bag of heroin. I mean, that was their first stop. And they're dead in, some hotel room on Colfax. Again, just a little bit of clinical here, but there are short-term and long-term effects of opioids, essentially, of heroin. The short-term effects I've already discussed a little bit. The long-term effects I've also discussed a little bit, but heart valve issues are a big deal. That's with any injectable drug. And, again, tolerance and withdrawal and are a big problem. And these are the organs that are primarily affected. Now, in Denver, we have a unique experience. We see combined deaths between heroin and methamphetamine. And in working with the clinicians, I found out that it's probably not the drugs being used at the same time. They're being cycled because the clinicians have a chance to talk to the addicts who are actually using. And instead of doing methamphetamine and heroin together is called a goofball, as opposed to a speedball with cocaine, right? Well, instead of doing that, what they're doing is they're doing heroin for a few days, and then they're kind of on a low, so they need to pick me up, and they do the methamphetamine, and then they're on a high for a while, and then they go back to heroin, and we're catching them at the point where both are in their system. And so I see a lot of combined methamphetamine and heroin deaths. I put this in your notes. It's a busy slide, but I really like it. This sort of gives you a relative value of the different drugs based on physical harm and dependence. And you can see that something like steroids, not a lot of dependence, more physical harm necessarily. And then, of course, heroin, you get high of everything. And that's really what this slide represents, how different drugs, how you gauge their risk. Anybody in here, how many of you have Narcan in your offices? Yeah, quite a few, right? Yeah, we do in Denver too. It's a benign drug, does nothing to somebody who's not on a narcotic and can potentially save their lives, right? It can reverse an overdose. Makes them really, really mad because you've just, it's like a immediate withdrawal symptom, but you've saved their life. We have it at the public library. All of my folks carry it. The caveat to that, though, is that it's probably a little maybe overdone. Drug companies have gone through great pains to make transdermal preparations. Most of these drugs aren't going to just get into your skin and touch, and you're going to all of a sudden drop dead from touching an illicit drug. So keep that in mind. But obviously, you don't want to inhale particles of carfentanil or something like that. So there is, there is a perspective to be had there. It's cheap. It's been around forever. I learned about it in medical school, but it wasn't being used much. And then all of a sudden now it's marketed. I said the public library has it on hand. My investigators carry it in their backpacks. Doctors have it. We have it in the autopsy suite. All the police carry it. People are issued it as they leave prison if they have a history. And it looks just like that. It's fairly easy to use. Some of the things that are you can recognize in overdose, the snoring respirations, right? You get that history from the family. Oh, he was snoring, and he stopped snoring. Yeah, that's a bad sign, obviously. Cyanosis, blue skin, blue lips, blue fingertips. They may seize because the brain's not getting enough oxygen. So here's a couple of quick cases to just kind of drive the point home. This is a young lady we pulled out of the bathroom at Whole Foods. Heroin is, I guess, organic, kind of. So you can tell that she has a lot of the stigmata of an addict. She has all these skin lesions. Don't know if they're really that well appreciated. Yeah, they are. She has, and those are only in areas where she can reach. So she's scratching at the skin. That's the heroin itch. Injection site right there, along with the obligatory tattoo. This is another lady that was found under the I-25 overpass. Got the Maryland state flag there. One thing that's also there is Narcan. The problem is you can't administer it to yourself. As you get symptoms, somebody's got to administer it to you. So having it there is a plus, but if you're using illicit drugs alone, a narcotic alone, nobody's there to help you out. And she also had injection sites. This is a heart valve from a chronic user. This is endocarditis. This is an interesting gentleman found dead in a kind of a temporary residence. You see the for rent sign still there. It says game over on the video game. I guess it was. What's this? It's a laxative, actually. Why would a young adult have a laxative sitting around there? This is the kind of stuff you take before a bowel prep and your colonoscopy or things like that. Well, that's his stomach. That's what's in his stomach. So this is a mule. He's transporting these things. And all it takes is one of those little containers to break open or get stuck. And he was really trying to make a lifetime living on this one, on this transport. We find people in our line of business in all different locations using, and some of the things we obviously look for, injection sites, or sometimes the needle is still in. Spoon there too. Paraphernalia present at the scene is very helpful. The foam cone that we see, sometimes that'll go away by the time the body makes it to the autopsy suite, so it's good for the investigators to capture that. And if you're not going to do an autopsy, which I still recommend a full autopsy in all of these, and that goes away, you've kind of lost some evidence if you haven't photographed it. Injection sites, other places you don't expect people to be injecting, like their neck. Sometimes you got to cut in and prove that it was the injection site. Often the needle goes through the vessel wall and creates hemorrhage around it. paraphernalia around. This is the heroin slump, right, or slouch. Just, collapse. And in the house of God, which I think the book's 40 years old now, this was the L sign, where they just clump over. That's an interesting place to inject yourself. And then, of course, you get the chronic stigmata. This is lung tissue that doesn't look tremendously impressive this way, but then when you polarize it, that's all the talc and crud that gets injected into the system, and the lungs are basically a filter. Long-term use. All right, well, let's finish up with just a couple of words on toxicology. Basically, I'm not up here to recommend any particular lab. You may have in-house toxicology. You may send it out. But use a very reputable lab. Make sure they have a toxicologist available for you to interact with. Most of us will start off with an initial basic type of approach. As I said, it really depends on what you're going to capture there. You want to at least get all the typical drugs of abuse, all the major prescription opioids that are abused: oxycodone, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, and obviously you want to capture the ethanol and some of the other illicits like cocaine and methamphetamine. Sometimes you have to cast your net wider and work with the toxicology lab. You might find something on the scene that you need to test for that isn't in their basic panel. Blood is the preferred specimen. Peripheral blood is better than central blood due to postmortem redistribution that occurs. Urine, I mentioned already, may be particularly useful, especially if you're looking for that elusive 6-monoacetylmorphine. Testing the vitreous fluid, and you can do drug testing of vitreous fluid as well. It's not just for electrolytes and glucose and things like that. You might find 6-monoacetylmorphine in vitreous fluid. That'll cinch your case. Consult with the toxicologist for complex cases, for the fentanyl analogs and things like that. And then obviously interpretation. I still recommend a full autopsy on all these. There are no safe levels of heroin, no safe levels of other illicits like cocaine and methamphetamine and ecstasy, but you do take into account the combined effects of things. So if you have more than one drug that's giving respiratory depression, then I tend to sign a death certificate, and the state wants you to list all of the drugs. Most states now they don't want an answer combined drug intoxication or mixed drug intoxication. They want either the drugs, intoxication of A, B, C, and D, or they want combined drug intoxication, parentheses, heroin, comma, methamphetamine, comma, ethanol. So identification is really important in our line of work, so make sure you're not sending out scientifically unidentified bodies. And I am up to about the 2-minute mark, so I guess if there's any quick questions, otherwise I'm sure the next speaker's got to tee off right at the top of the hour. Anybody have anything? Or right here. The question is, do I see imaging helping that? It does. And I was at Dover for years, so I was with the original sort of vertopsy, although we always did an autopsy after CT scanning. But our bodies began getting full CT scans back in 2003. So it's an adjunct, in my opinion. Not to throw out trade names or anything, but they were here. We're getting our Lodox in September. I plan to make good use of it. Don't have a CT scanner. I see it as an adjunct. I don't see myself yet at the point where I'm going to say, I'll just do a CT scan and I can forego the autopsy. Yes? Pneumo. Yeah. Wow, yeah. A pneumothorax from injecting into the neck. That's certainly a complication. I've dropped lungs before putting in chest tubes and doing thoracentesis, but good case. Over there, last question, sorry. Combined toxic effects of heroin. If I have 6-mem, I say the word heroin. Families don't like that. They often push back. But if I have 6-mem, I say heroin. And if I have those 3 drugs or any combination of drugs that I think are physiologically active and can contribute to the death, I name them all. All right, thank you.